Welcome to this week's OK at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, and my colleague Russell Berger from the Offit Kurman Labor and Employment Group. And this week we're talking about wages and taking deductions from wages. Really, it's definitely something for employers to pay attention to. I mean, I know we've talked about this on the show before, that anything having to do with wages, you really want to pay attention to. It's got potentially really steep consequences if you don't handle employee wages properly or pay them properly. So when we look at what clients are doing, when we look at their handbooks or their practices, this is something that comes up a lot, just to make sure that they're doing it properly. So what are some things they need to keep in mind, Russell?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the place where it comes up the most for me is when an employee becomes a former employee and they still have a computer, they still have equipment, they have some obligation remaining to the now former employer, and the former employer will say, "Well, I owe them their final paycheck, and I just take it out of that." And certainly under Maryland law, the answer is not unless you've taken a couple proactive steps to be able to do so. Because what Maryland law requires is that you have a signed writing in advance that authorizes that deduction. So, for example, if you have an employee in Maryland who takes their laptop home and you want to be able to withhold the cost of replacing that laptop if it's not returned after employment, you have to have them sign a form in advance that says exactly that. Same thing when it comes to, you see a lot with credit cards as well. Personal charges on a credit card, how do I recoup that? You can't do it from wages, and it doesn't mean you couldn't still sue the person, but you can't self-help to wages unless you've got written authorization to do so in advance. And there are other states in the Mid-Atlantic that have more onerous rules. So, for example, New York really doesn't let you deduct much of anything from wages. But at least here in Maryland, if you have a little foresight and you plan and you put that form in place, which is easy enough to put together, you have a much better remedy than having to file a lawsuit against your former employee for the 1,500, 2,000 bucks, whatever it is that you have to you want to recoup for the laptop.
Yeah, it can usually be a more of a motivating factor as well, for people to actually want to return those things, as opposed to being like, "Oh, come chase me, sue me." I don't think you'll do that. So it's something that's definitely helpful and something you want to plan ahead with, and that definitely varies by state. So it's one of those things, which is a lot
But
of employment laws. So.
yeah, well, and in Maryland, we've got trouble damages if you don't pay someone wages at the end of their employment. So a lot of times clients will say, "Well, but if I don't pay them, like, what are they going to, they're just going to sue me for it. Like, let them sue me and I'll take the risk. I don't care if they file a lawsuit." But the reality is that if you do that and you withhold that $2,000 for the laptop, they're then suing you for $6,000 under the Maryland wage payment law, plus their attorney's fees, plus your own attorney's fees. So, now the clients don't make that election, but like that risk is much greater than just, oh, they could come after me for the wages I didn't pay them.
Yeah, well, and that's a risk that can be managed by just getting things in order up front. And I also see it a lot with wage overpayments. So I get a lot of questions around, well, we accidentally added an extra zero to that paycheck, or we've been accidentally overpaying an employee for 6 weeks and we just realized we had it in the system wrong, and what do we do now? And there are exceptions to the rule that you just described, around these deductions and written authorizations when it comes to overpayment of wages in most states, and at the federal level, where essentially the overpayment of wages is seen as a loan or as an advancement of wages. So they've already been paid for future work, even though they didn't mean to do that. So there's different rules that apply to that allow employers to be more flexible with their deductions and taking the deduction, taking the wages down to zero, post tax and after paying things like running it through the payroll system, to be able to take that back as repayment for the advancement of wages, because employers can be stuck, depending on how big the overpayment is, can be stuck with that same potential issue of, well, how am I going to get this money back? A lot of times they can also work with the employee. I mean, that's usually my first piece of advice is, if depending on how big the number is the employee still employed, is to see if you can work it out with the employee first and say, all right, we can get you on a payment plan to repay that, or in the event that they still have the money in their account, they can just turn it right back over to the employer. And also having policies around that to say, to encourage employees to keep an eye on their paychecks, and if they see an overpayment, that they need to alert the employer right away to try to prevent these issues of weeks or months of overpayment, that then if both the employer and the employee is not paying attention, and depending on how much that employee makes, it might be difficult for them to repay that amount. And especially if an employee leaves or quits, then you're really in a tough position, because you don't have wages to draw from. So that's also something that I see a lot of.
Yeah, it's obviously, I know everyone pays close attention and tries not to make those errors on payroll, but I also see it happen with commissions a fair amount, where a commission gets misallocated, or there's some type of issue where there's an overpayment. So that issue certainly does come up. And one of the other things you said made me think, one of the other areas where it's important to have a wage deduction provision is if you loan money to an employee. If, and not specifically like, I mean, even specific to an advance on pay, but a loan to an employee, even if it says there's going to be payment terms, you want to have an ability to pull that from wages and simplify the process. And if there's a default, you have some remedy there as well. So that's another place to keep this in mind for.
Yeah, definitely. Well, bottom line, if it touches wages, make sure you're paying close attention. Right? It's one of the most important things you do as an employer, is paying your employees, paying them properly, and making sure you follow the rules in that regard. So,
well, it's certainly something that employees are going to be sensitive to for good reason.
yeah. Well, thanks, Russell. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sarah.